Hey there. Tonight we're stepping aboard a 16th century ship. The world was wider then, and these vessels carried sailors, merchants, and explorers between distant ports. This is the story of life on those ships. The routines, the work, the fears, and the quiet moments that passed between landfalls. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. Meanwhile, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. So dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin with life aboard a 16th century ship. A 16th century ship was a collection of parts arranged to perform particular tasks. Each part had a name and a purpose. Together, they allowed the vessel to float, to move, and to carry people and goods across wide stretches of water. In this way, the physical structure determined many of the routines and limitations of life on board. At the base of the vessel lay the keel. It was a long timber running along the bottom from bow to stern. Frames, set at intervals along the keel, gave the hull its shape. Planks were fixed to those frames to form the outer skin of the ship. Builders tightened seams with a mixture of fiber and pitch. That caulking kept water out and made the hull reasonably watertight. Over time, the hull would swell and settle, and the shipwrights and carpenters learned to work with those changes. There were decks arranged one above another. The main deck was the primary working surface. Forward lay the forecastle, a raised area that offered shelter and a place for some crew to sleep. Aft rose the quarterdeck and the poop deck, higher platforms used by officers to observe the sails and give orders. Below decks was the hold, where cargo, ballast, and provisions were stowed. The space there was dark and low. Air moved slowly through it, and it required constant attention to prevent rot and bad smells. Masts rose up through the decks. A typical ship of this period might carry a foremast, a mainmast, and a mizzenmast. Cross spars, called yards, held the larger square sails. Later designs included triangular sails set on long sloping yards. Ropes led from mast to deck in many directions. That network, the rigging, controlled the sails. Sailors adjusted it to change the shape and angle of each sail. In this way, the crew controlled speed and direction. At the stern, a large rudder connected to the steering mechanism guided the ship. Early on, a tiller could be pushed or pulled by several men. Later, a wheel appeared on some vessels, but during most of the 16th century, steering required physical effort. Anchors sat beside the bow, heavy and made of iron. When needed, men hauled them up by capstan or windlass. The capstan stood amidships. It was a vertical drum turned by bars, and it helped raise anchors or heavy loads. A ship carried its own means of life. The galley was the small cooking area. Open fires required care. Cooks used large cauldrons and simple utensils to prepare meals mostly from salted meat, hard biscuits, and occasionally fresh fish or vegetables taken on short voyages. Water was stored in barrels. Wine or beer sometimes supplemented or replaced fresh water because stored water tended to go bad. Barrels and casks were made and repaired by coopers who worked below decks or on shore. Space was never abundant. Hammocks and simple bedding filled the forecastle and other sleeping areas. Personal belongings were limited. In the hold, cargo occupied the largest spaces, and sailors learned precise ways to stow goods so they did not shift at sea. Heavy items went low and near the keel. Lighter and more fragile items rode atop. Ballast stones or sand could be moved to change how the ship sat in the water, a small but important adjustment. A clear structure of command governed life on board. At the top was the captain. His authority covered navigation, discipline, and the welfare of the voyage. Below him, a small number of officers carried responsibility for watches and specific tasks. Common titles included the first mate and the second mate. The bosun, often called the bosun, supervised the deck crew and took care of ropes, sails, and small repairs. The master or pilot handled navigation, charts, and instructions for steering a course. In merchant settings, where cargo mattered most, a factor or agent might represent the interests of those who own the goods. Most of the people on board were ordinary sailors. They carried out the day-to-day labor. Able seamen had more experience and therefore more responsibility. Ordinary seamen learned their tasks over time. Boys and apprentices performed primarily basic chores while learning the trade. Governance rested on rules and agreements. Before leaving port, a written set of articles often recorded the terms of service for the crew. These articles described wages, shares in profit, rules for conduct, and penalties for offenses. They bound men to duty and gave a common reference for discipline. Punishments ranged from loss of wages to more severe measures. Discipline was strict because mistakes at sea could cost lives and the loss of ship and cargo. Work was organized around watches. The day divided into periods of duty and rest. Sailors stood watch in shifts, managing sails, steering, and lookout duties. The first call to action might be early in the morning, when light returned and tasks resumed. Meanwhile, others took care of repairs, cleaning, and preparing food. During long voyages, small routines grounded the crew and brought a semblance of order. Several specialized roles made daily life and long voyages possible. The helmsman steered the ship. He learned to read the feel of the helm and to follow the orders of the officer on deck. His work required concentration, especially in rough weather. The lookout climbed into the crow's nest, high on the mainmast. From there, he scanned the horizon for land, other ships, and signs of danger. His reports could change the course of a day. The carpenter kept wooden structures sound. When planks split, when rigging chafed through, or when a mast cracked, the carpenter worked quickly to repair or replace parts. He carried instruments and spare timber and could fashion temporary fixes until proper work could be done in port. The presence of a skilled carpenter made a long voyage far safer. The sailmaker repaired and replaced torn sails. Sail canvas suffered from salt, wind, and sun. In this way, bad weather could quickly reduce a ship's ability to move. Sailmakers patched tiers and cut new panels from spare canvas. Coopers kept barrels in condition, sealing and resealing staves and hoops. Their work protected water and food from spoilage. A ship often carried a surgeon or barber surgeon. His medical knowledge was limited by the standards of the time, but he treated wounds, set broken bones, and cared for common illnesses. Hygiene was a practical concern. Over time, crews learned methods for cleaning and airing bedding, for draining bilge water, and for storing food in ways that reduced rot. Still, disease and infection remained constant dangers. Responsibilities overlapped. The bosun might help with rigging and with directing deckhands during maneuvers. Ordinary seamen did much of the hauling and heavy labor. When work required more hands, the entire crew could be called on deck. In this way, tasks were communal, even when command remained hierarchical. Shipbuilding began on shore where timber was abundant. Master shipwrights planned and oversaw the work. They selected large trees for keels and masts and shaped them with adzes and saws. Frames were raised first, then planks were fastened to form the hull. Iron nails and wooden trunnels fixed components together. Craftsmen used tools such as augers, hammers, and planes. Their work combined tradition with experience. Shipyards grew where trade demanded vessels, and where shore facilities allowed launching and fitting. Naming a ship was an intentional act. Owners chose names that reflected patronage, origin, or purpose. Many ships received names of saints or religious titles. Others bore the names of towns, sponsors, monarchs, or abstract qualities. Naming rituals existed in different ports and cultures. Some captains and crews considered a name a marker of identity. In this way, a ship became associated with its voyages, its owners, and its crew. Renaming sometimes occurred when ownership changed, and people tended to treat such changes with caution. Once the hull was complete, builders fitted masts, rigging, and sails. They loaded anchors, supplies, and weapons when defense required them. Armament varied by vessel and purpose. Some ships carried small cannon or swivel guns for defense against raiders or to enforce authority. These weapons needed stowage and care, and guns required trained crews to operate them. Maintenance continued at sea. Sailors inspected timbers and fastenings while the vessel was moored or underway. When fouling on the hull slowed the ship, crews planned for careening. In that process, the ship lay on its side in shallow water, so workers could scrape barnacles and seaweed from the bottom. Caulking needed renewing. Ropes needed replacing. Masts and spars underwent regular checks. At the same time, carpenters kept a stock of spare planks and fittings for emergency repairs. Supplies mattered greatly. Provisions lasted only so long. Ship captains and officers planned for resupply at ports and for fresh food and water as opportunities arose. Over the course of a long voyage, the quality and quantity of supplies affected morale and health. In this way, logistics often determined how long a ship could remain at sea. On the day before departure, activity on board heightened. Sailors moved heavy items into the hold. Cargo was lashed and balanced. Officers checked charts and instruments. The carpenter made final adjustments to planks and seams. The boatswain inspected ropes and pulleys. Coopers sealed the last barrels. At the same time, the galley prepared rations for the initial days. Men secured their gear and readied themselves for the work and watch that lay ahead. Once all preparations concluded, the ship would take a final set of small steps. Orders circulated across the decks. Signals passed from the captain through his officers to the crew. Lines were led to cleats. Sails were furled or set according to the wind. Men stationed themselves at key points. At the capstan, along the rail, beside the mast. The anchor held the ship until the precise moment when it would be weighed and stowed. Meanwhile, the pilot checked landmarks and the tide, and the helmsman stood ready to guide the vessel through the channel. As the hours approached for departure, the crew settled into familiar roles. Some busied themselves with last-minute maintenance. Others secured belongings. A few checked the small personal details that mattered during a long absence from shore. In this way, the ship moved from a place of preparation to a state of readiness. The work of many hands and careful planning promised the next phase, leaving the harbor and meeting the open sea. Preparations began days or weeks before the ship slipped free of the quay. Men moved through a steady list of tasks that had become familiar through repetition. Officers checked inventories and signed off on stores. Coopered barrels were counted. Sacks of biscuit, casks of salted meat, hidden boxes of oil and vinegar were stowed with the care that experience taught. Fresh water filled some barrels, while others held wine or beer meant to last longer. Tools and spare tackle were set aside, and carpenters and sailmakers finished small repairs. In this way, the hull and rigging were not the only concerns. The means of living at sea received careful attention. Prayer and ritual marked some parts of preparation. When a ship carried a chaplain, a final mass might be said on board. Men took turns kneeling near a simple image or a carved crucifix. They made the sign of the cross and asked for protection. Those without a cleric still chose words and gestures that mattered to them. Simple practices brought a measure of order to the unknown that lay ahead. Meanwhile, superstition threaded through the work. Old habits guided choices about when to set sail and how to handle the ship. Some refused to whistle on deck. Others avoided certain repair tasks on specific days. Coins might be sewn into clothing or cast into the sea. A small trinket could be tied to a rope. In this way, private and shared beliefs shaped the mood of a ship's company. Superstitions also influenced how a ship was named and cared for. Many captains and owners preferred names invoking saints or holy figures. A name suggested protection as much as identity. When ownership changed, renaming occurred with caution. Some crews would insist on a ceremony or a charm if the name changed. At the same time, practical checks proceeded without delay. The bosun inspected blocks, rove lines, and seizing, and he ordered new parts when needed. Coopers checked hoops. Sailmakers spliced and patched spare canvas. In this way, the outward, visible readiness matched inner hopes and anxieties. Farewells had their own rhythm. Families and friends came to the water's edge. Goods were transferred, last payments made, and hands were shaken. Wives, fathers, sons, and daughters stood on the quay. Some remained close until the anchor raised. Others left earlier, not wishing to watch the ship move away. There were quick embraces and longer conversations. Men signed articles and declared their commitments. Some wrote short notes to leave with owners or chaplains. A few made small bequests or changed their wills. Over time, those routines made the parting feel less abrupt, though the feelings themselves did not diminish. Fear of never returning existed openly and quietly. Men spoke of storms and of sickness, of pirates and wrecks. Stories of past voyages circulated on the quay and on the dockside taverns. Some people avoided looking at the ship after farewell. Others climbed a small hill or moved down a neighboring quay to see the vessel pass. The captain also felt the weight of that fear. His decisions affected many lives and property. He checked charts, made plans for the route, and consulted pilots about tides and local hazards. Meanwhile, families went home and tried to settle while the ship prepared to leave. In this way, the moment of departure carried the work of many hands and the anxieties of many minds. The final day brought a sense of orderly haste. Men lashed and stowed, tightened small ropes, and made sure the hold closed cleanly. The The carpenter tightened planks where they showed movement. The cooper sealed the last cask. Officers read the ship's articles aloud or confirmed understanding. Those responsibilities completed, the helmsman sat ready, and the pilot checked landmarks once more. The anchor remained in place until the chosen hour. When the signal came, the capstan turned. Men heaved at bars. The anchor rose, heavy and noisy, and the ship moved slowly from its mooring. Immediate change followed as the vessel entered open water. The hull began to respond to waves in a continuous way. Sway and roll arrived without fanfare. Many men felt a simple surprise in how the body adjusted. Walk required new attention. Steps became measured. Hands found railings and cleats. Hammocks and bedding swung in time. Over the first day or two, sailors learned to move with the ship rather than against it. That learning took patience. Newcomers grew quiet and careful. Experienced seamen gave brief advice and set examples. In this way, the crew adjusted, and the ship became a mobile place of work once again. Seasickness affected some immediately, and others after a day or two. Heads turned pale and stomachs rejected food. Remedies were simple and practical. Captains sometimes ordered light rations or allowed men to stay on deck in the fresh air. Wine and vinegar served as mixers for medicine. Salt water dabbing or the smelling of strong herbs provided relief to a few. Meanwhile, the ship's routine continued despite illness. Watches rotated, sails needed setting, and the lookout kept to his post. Over time, many who had felt ill found their systems settle and the discomfort lessen. Others remained uneasy for the voyage's length. In this way, the body and the sea established a new, slow pattern. The first days also tested systems of command and cooperation. Orders flowed from quarterdeck to forecastle. Men responded to calls to reef or set sails. Learning the ship's particular quirks mattered. Each vessel behaved differently under wind and sea. The captain and his officers observed, adjusted, and taught. Sail trimming became a constant task as the wind shifted. Small routine tasks consumed time, roping down loose gear, swabbing the deck when water washed aboard, and checking lashings below. Meanwhile, the galley tried to maintain mealtimes. Fire required careful tending. Cooked rations were simple yet regular. In this way, daily needs kept people moving and offered a framework to their days. Sound became an unceasing companion. Ropes scraped blocks, and the lines rasped through a sailor's hands. Blocks and pulleys clicked and clacked as men hauled. Sails flapped when wind hit them hard, changing from soft movement to sharp snaps as they filled. The yardarms groaned when a sudden gust forced a change. The ship's timbers gave their own responses. The hull creaked as it flexed. Boards shifted. The capstan and windlass made a low mechanical complaint as men worked them. Chains and anchor gear chimed when hauled. Even steady motion produced noise. Water hissed along the sides and occasionally slapped against the bow. In this way, sound recorded the ship's life. Voices and signals added a human layer to the mechanical sounds. Short orders cut through the regular noise. A bosun's whistle, a shouted hard lee, or belay could change the movement of men immediately. The captain might call for trimming on the quarterdeck, and men took their places. At night, lantern light and the quiet of lowered voices contrasted with the daytime work. Officers kept watch over sleeping crew. At times, the bell marked the hours of a watch. In this way, time on board gathered its own audible markers. Small, repeating tasks smoothed the transition from shore to open sea. Lines required splicing or reseizing. Sail patches appeared on working canvas. Decks received regular swabbing to remove salt and grime. Storage below demanded attention. Barrels needed tending to prevent leakage and rot. Over time, the crew established routines for cleaning, cooking, and caring for clothes and bedding. Boys and apprentices learned these tasks by observation and by direct instruction. Meanwhile, the helmsman adapted to the feel of the tiller, and the pilot refined courses by taking observations. In this way, competence grew through steady practice. Weather changes remained an underlying concern. Forecasting depended on sky and sea, on the captain's experience, and on local knowledge. Overcast skies, a shift in wind direction, or a sudden rise in swell could prompt immediate action. Sails were reefed. Extra lines were made fast. A prepared crew acted efficiently because small delays could become dangerous. At the same time, calm days allowed for repair and rest. Men repaired gear and scoured the ship's surfaces. The carpenter checked for slow leaks. Sailmakers cut new patches. In this way, the balance between urgent action and steady maintenance defined early life at sea. Personal adjustments were practical. Men tied personal items close to bodies or within a chest that they kept under a hammock. Simple rituals persisted. A sailor might touch a small token before leaving the forecastle. Others shared stories or set aside time for quiet prayer. Letters and packages left on the quay reached their recipients later, if addressed through proper channels. In this way, customs from shore traveled with people and altered to fit life on board. As the ship settled into its course, the routine of watches and tasks set the pace for the voyage ahead. Work and rest alternated in rhythms that both constrained and reassured the crew. Over time, a pattern emerged for each day and each watch. The daily list of chores, the sound of lines and sails, the careful tending of provisions, and the small rituals of belief and farewell, all combined to form a continuous fabric of habit. Ahead lay the details of that fabric, the work on deck that occupied most hours and most hands, and the procedures by which a crew maintained order in motion. In the next sections, those rhythms and duties will appear more fully, carried forward by the ship's course and by the steady labor of those who lived aboard. Work aboard a ship in the 16th century was organized around time and task. Watches divided the day into regular intervals so that the vessel could be managed without tiring any single group for too long. Officers measured time by the bell and by custom. Men stood 4-hour watches through most days, with shorter dog watches in the evening to allow rotation of those watches. In this way, a man who had the middle watch one night would not have the same watch every night. The captain and his officers set the schedule. The bosun, the bosun's mate, and petty officers put it into practice, calling men to their places and assigning tasks. Each watch had an outline of duties. The lookout kept to his post at the masthead or in the bowsprit platform. He scanned for sails, breakers, and birds. Helmsmen steered to the course set by the pilot or the officer of the watch. Sail handling required teams. When a change of sail was needed, sailors ran to their stations, belayed lines, and hauled on the proper ropes. In calmer moments, men repaired canvas or attended to small chores. Those whose work was below, such as the cooper and the carpenter, took watches that fit the rhythm of the ship. Cooks and their assistants worked on schedules arranged around meal times. In this way, the ship functioned continuously, with each person taking a place in the pattern. Routine brought structure. At the beginning of a watch, men checked their ropes and their tools. They inspected blocks and deadeyes, looked over the running rigging, and tested lashings. If a halyard showed where it might be spliced at once or marked for later attention. Meanwhile, the carpenter checked for loose planks and for signs of strain at key joints. He had his caulking irons and mallets ready. The cooper checked barrel hoops and staves, sealing any leakage he found. Those small tasks, repeated, kept the ship serviceable. In this way, the daily list of minor repairs reduced the chance that any one failure would become a crisis. Cleaning occupied a surprisingly large portion of time. Salt and spray brought grime that settled on deck and below. Water pooled after rain and after heavy weather. Men swabbed decks and scuppers to keep bilge water moving. They swept away rotted rope ends and swept out the spaces where damp and mold might begin. Galley ashes needed removal. Waste from food preparation and the remains of meals required regular attention to avoid disease. Sailors scrubbed and scraped, and they tossed out refuse at regular intervals. Over time, these actions meant a calmer hold and fewer pests. Keeping the ship steady demanded constant vigilance. Sails had to be set and trimmed to suit the wind. Reefing was a common task, especially when squalls approached. Men shortened sail to reduce strain and to steady motion. When a sudden gust arrived, orders came quickly and everyone moved. Lines were paid out or hauled in according to command. Meanwhile, the helmsman adjusted the rudder to keep a steady heading. Ballast and stowage received occasional attention because a badly stowed hold could alter trim. In this way, small actions preserved the larger balance of the ship. Repair work continued without pause. A torn sail might be cut and stitched into a patch. Sailmakers carried needles and waxed twine to mend canvas even while at sea. Riggers climbed aloft to inspect shrouds and ratlins, replacing or splicing worn parts. The carpenter tended to the kelson and to joints where strain most often showed. He made temporary repairs when necessary and recorded tasks that needed fuller attention in port. Meanwhile, specialists like the caulker went below to seal seams, and the cooper kept barrels that carried water and provisions serviceable. In this way, the crew maintained the material fabric of the ship through steady care. Work songs and stories threaded the days. Many tasks required coordinated effort with a clear rhythm. Men used chants or calls to time pulls at a capstan or at a sheet. Those work songs reduced the need for lengthy directions. A leader sang a line and the crew replied, matching effort to sound. The songs could be brief and highly practical. In other moments, the men told stories. A sailor might recount a voyage to a particular port, describe a hazard he had known, or repeat a memory of a storm. The telling of these stories kept attention and passed technical knowledge between generations without the formality of instruction. In this way, practical speech and song combined with action. Camaraderie grew from shared labor and shared provisions. Men developed nicknames and private jokes. They watched one another closely and intervened when someone moved dangerously. Apprentices learned not only how to splice a rope, but also how to read the intentions of those above them. When a man suffered from an injury or from illness, others aided him and shared scarce comfort. Gifts of tobacco or a portion of meat passed between men. In this way, small acts of support created social bonds that mattered in the long days at sea. Leisure found its place within the schedule. When weather allowed, men played simple games. Boards for drafts, dice, and card-like games passed from hand to hand. They used spare rope to practice knots and contest each other in speed or skill. Those who could read might copy letters for others or pass along news. Many wrote short notes to be carried to a future port. Quiet times also allowed for more private rituals. Some men spent hours in prayer or in singing devotional verses. Others took time to sew, mend clothing, or carve simple items. In this way, diversion and repair blended into daily life. Boredom presented a persistent problem. Long stretches of routine and calm could make days seem to blur. The ship offered limited variety. Men developed small personal routines to keep their minds engaged. They practiced skills, learned parts of the rigging by repeated motion, and kept lists of tasks in their heads. Meanwhile, conversations ranged from the factual to the fanciful. A man might recount what he had seen in port, while another planned future trade or landfall. In this way, mental occupation served as a practical defense against tedium. Storms tested training and discipline. When a weather system rose, the tone of the deck changed. Orders became brisk and direct. Men lashed down loose goods, secured the hatches, and shortened sails. The boatswain and his mates moved through shouts and whistles to place hands where they were most needed. Pumps ran continually when water found a way into the hold. The carpenter checked for shifting timbers. Those on watch observed the horizon for changes that might require a fresh response. Each action fit into a known pattern because improvisation in a storm could be dangerous. In this way, practiced routine limited the scope for error. Fear and fatigue were real in heavy weather. Sleep became broken. Crews worked in shifts that left little room for long rest. Men required quick meals and short periods of sleep, sometimes on deck and sometimes in their hammocks. Officers judged when to stand down and when prolonged effort would increase safety. When danger passed, the crew took time to repair and to recover. In this way, storms altered the rhythm of life, but did not break the chain of duties. Isolation remained constant when open sea stretched in all directions. Contact with land took place only at chosen moments. Letters and news arrived slowly. Emotions of longing and impatience lived alongside steady practical concern. Sailors coped by creating small anchors to hold their days. Personal tokens, small pieces of cloth or carved tokens, remained close at hand. Men kept to private rituals that eased separation. Meanwhile, shared tasks and mutual dependence provided a social framework. The knowledge that another man's careful action might save many lives helped maintain order. In this way, social structure supported individual endurance. Conflict did occur, and crews managed it in practical ways. Captain and officers maintained discipline with a clear set of expectations. Infractions received measured punishments according to the ship's articles. At times, frictions arose over shares, duties, or the distribution of scarce goods. Officers worked to settle disputes quickly so that cooperation could continue. In this way, a sense of order and fair treatment underpinned daily life. Night brought its own demands. Watches shortened at times, and the relief for those on deck had to be quiet. Lanterns provided limited light because too much light could reveal position and spoil the night's work. Sleep in hammocks required learning to secure bedding and to guard personal items. At certain nights, the bell and the signal of the watch preserved the ship's rhythm. In this way, darkness did not bring leisure only, but continued attention. Small pleasures mattered. The sight of land promised different food and the chance to stretch tired limbs. A good loaf or a fresh fish lifted spirits. Tobacco, small luxuries, and a remembered face from home sustained men. The captain recognized such morale, and sometimes allowed small privileges on calm days. In this way, small rewards helped the crew to continue under hard conditions. These patterns and practices led into another set of concerns that occupied as much attention as work on deck. Below the open boards, the stores of the ship required constant attention, and how men fed themselves determined their strength and endurance. Orders from the captain about rationing, the cooper's care of barrels, and the cook's daily management of provisions formed a continuing story of survival and habit. The next section of this narration will move down from the sails and the rigging to those stores, and to the ways food and water shaped every decision on board. Below the open boards, the stores of the ship shaped almost every decision. What went into the hold determined how long the vessel could remain at sea, where the captain thought it sensible to steer, and how men measured the passing of weeks. Food and water were not merely supplies. They were the daily facts that kept bodies moving and minds steady. In this part of the voyage, the cook's pot and the cooper's barrels were as important as the sails and the rudder. Typical meals had a simplicity born of necessity. Hardtack, salted meat, and dried peas formed the basic trio. Hardtack was a dense, dry biscuit baked to last. It resisted mold and most insects, and it could be stacked and stored for months. Sailors did not eat it dry if they could avoid it. Meanwhile, cooks boiled or soaked the biscuits in water or in the pot with other ingredients to soften them. Bread, when available, became a rare comfort. Salted meat provided protein. Large cuts of beef or pork were heavily salted and packed into casks. The salt drew moisture out and slowed decay. Dried peas and other legumes supplied bulk and a limited range of vitamins. These staples were often cooked together in stews or pottages that simmered in a single large cauldron. The same pot served many mouths. Over time, the pot gave rise to routines about who ladled first and who obtained second helpings. The galley worked within strict limits. Fuel was precious, and flames were dangerous. Cooks managed small fires beneath a single copper or iron pot. They tended stews slowly, using scraps of fat and leftover broth to flavor hardtack and peas. When available, fat from salted meat was rendered and used as a cooking oil. Sauces were simple. Salt, sometimes a little vinegar, and whatever dried herbs or onions survived the voyage became the seasonings. For officers, there were occasional conveniences. Wine or beer might be kept for their tables. For ordinary sailors, the daily ration of food could be thin and repetitive. In this way, the galley reinforced the ship's hierarchy, while also providing a shared place for sustenance. Water posed a deeper problem. Fresh water is heavy, and its supply is limited by the size and number of casks the ship can carry. Barrels of water sat low in the hold. The cooper's skill mattered because a bad bung, a leak, or a cracked hoop could turn fresh water sour in weeks. Over time, water in a cask grew flat or brackish. Tasting it became an act of judgment. Captains ordered careful control of access. Men drew water on a rationed basis, often under supervision. Rain offered relief when it came, and sailors stretched sails and canvas to catch it in casks. The deck fittings and spare sheets sometimes served as improvised collectors. Meanwhile, wine and beer were considered safer to drink because fermentation limited the growth of many harmful organisms. Ships that carried ample beer or wine had an advantage in both health and morale. Preservation methods extended beyond salt and drying. Salting was the principal method for meat and fish. The process required large quantities of coarse salt and a measured packing of meat in layers. Smoking supplemented salting in some regions. Smoking added flavor and reduced surface moisture, but it required fuel and a place to hang meat safely. Pickling was another approach. Vegetables and some meats could be preserved in vinegar or brine. This method offered some variety when stored jars could be kept sealed. Drying worked well for legumes and some fruits. Citrus, when it could be stored, retained some freshness, but was rarely available for extended periods. In this way, preservation relied on ingredients carried from the outset, and on the skill of those who prepared stores before departure. Despite these measures, spoilage occurred. Rats and mice gnawed at sacks and barrels. Worms and weevils bored into biscuits and flour. Barrels sometimes developed leaks that let in salt water or pests. Dampness encouraged mold in corners of the hold. The cooper and the carpenter worked to mitigate these threats. They lifted barrels, retightened hoops, and stowed casks off the floor on timbers to allow air circulation. They fumigated holds when they could, and they salted or sealed vulnerable goods. Even with these efforts, the quality of provisions declined with time. Men learned to inspect their food and to cut away the worst parts, to boil questionable meat for longer, and to soak infested biscuits to remove pests. In this way, practical measures reduced risks, though they did not eliminate them. Disease followed from scarcity and from the nature of stored food. Scurvy became one of the most feared ailments on long voyages. Men developed swollen gums, loose teeth, and exhaustion. Wounds stopped healing, and joints became painful. In the 16th century, doctors aboard ship and surgeons on shore observed the condition, but did not yet understand its nutritional cause. Over time, sailors and captains noted that fresh fruit and green vegetables offered relief. They made stops to take on water and to gather greens where they could. Meanwhile, other illnesses arose from spoiled food and contaminated water. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections could spread through a ship quickly. Lice, fleas, and tick-borne fevers added to the burden. The surgeon and the cooper, the cook and the captain, each played a part in preventing and treating these problems. In this way, health depended on both material supplies and on choices about when and where to seek fresh provisions. Some remedies were folk practice, and some were the best medicine available at the time. Archival accounts describe the use of vinegar, of pickled cabbage, and of certain juices. Men chewed the rinds of citrus fruits when they had them. Others relied on broths and on the careful cleansing of wounds. When disease spread, officers isolated the sick when possible. They recorded symptoms and kept lists of men who were unfit for duty. Meanwhile, the crew adjusted by sharing tasks and by taking on the extra labor needed to keep the ship afloat. In this way, practical care and social organization reduced, though they did not always stop, the effects of illness. Because so much depended on stores, sharing food became a social act as well as a logistical necessity. Rations existed to prevent disputes. The ship's articles, agreed before departure, usually specified daily allowances. These rules aimed to ensure fairness and to prevent hoarding. Yet enforcement required attention. Officers supervised distributions. Petty officers and stewards measured portions. Men who neglected their duties risked reduced shares. Conversely, those who demonstrated loyalty or skill sometimes received small extras. Personal stores sometimes appeared. Officers and a few sailors brought extra provisions or illicit goods. These private supplies could be a source of tension. Over time, the norms of sharing developed into an informal economy aboard ship. Tobacco, small pieces of meat, or a hand-rolled cigarette could be exchanged for news or for a favor. In this way, the distribution of food became a currency of social life. Food itself shaped morale. The sight of a fresh catch brought visible relief. Fish taken from the sea provided immediate variety. Seabirds sometimes fell into the ship's nets or struck the rigging, and men seized the chance for meat. On occasion, a landfall brought fresh fruits, leafy greens, or a supply of cattle. These moments transformed the ship's routine. Men washed in streams, cleaned their clothes, and ate plates of fresh food that tasted unmistakably different from the standard fare. Officers recognized these opportunities as chances to repair both bodies and spirits. They might grant a day of rest or an extra ration. Meanwhile, small pleasures persisted even at sea. A good loaf, when it appeared in port, drew communal attention. The sharing of a small piece of cheese, a bit of butter, or a tobacco hand-rolled by a friend encouraged bonds that mattered in the long stretches between landfalls. Discipline and fairness helped maintain that morale. Captains and officers settled disputes over food quickly because the continuation of cooperation depended on it. Theft and hoarding received punishments that were public and procedural. At the same time, captains could exercise discretion. In times of abundance, they rewarded brave or useful behavior with extra portions. In times of scarcity, they balanced needs with the plan for continuation of the voyage. The distribution of food thus served as a mechanism of command, as well as a basic necessity. In this way, leadership and provisioning were closely linked. Fishing and opportunistic gathering softened scarcity. Men cast lines from the stern, lowered nets when fish were near, and when islands appeared, went ashore to collect shellfish, birds, and fresh water. Such work required both luck and skill. Over time, crews developed techniques for preserving freshly caught fish, often by salting what they could not eat immediately. The cook turned a catch into a fresh stew or a quick roast. When weather made fishing impossible, the crew returned to the stored staples and to careful rationing. Storage methods mattered for both food and water. Barrels, casks, sacks, and chests organized the hold. Some goods required isolation from others. Grains and legumes stayed in dry sacks. Salted meat rested in brine-filled casks. Wine and beer occupied their own barrels. Officers kept inventories, sometimes noting the state of particular casks. The cooper inspected hoops and bungs regularly. He tested a cask by rolling it, listening to its sound, and by opening it when necessary. Over time, a good cooper could extend the life of a voyage by preventing small leaks from becoming catastrophic losses. In this way, maintenance and supply were continuous tasks, not one-time preparations. The choices made about provisions influenced navigation directly. A captain deciding whether to explore further or to put in at the nearest harbor considered how much water remained, the condition of the salted meat, the presence of scurvy among the men, and the weather forecast. Each of these facts limited or expanded possible routes. Meanwhile, the necessity of stopping for water and fresh food shaped the timing of landings and the selection of ports. In this way, the management of stores and the practice of navigation were in constant dialogue. As the voyage continued, conversations on deck increasingly turned to charts, currents, and the prospects for fresh provisions. Men compared the state of the hold with the features shown on the pilot's charts. Pilots consulted coastal appearances for suitable anchorages and for streams where water could be collected. Officers scanned headlands and bays for signs of habitation or of verdant slopes where cattle might be driven down for slaughter. In this way, the immediate needs below deck pushed the ship toward new geographies. The practical demands of food and water thus led naturally into another set of concerns. How to find safe harbors, how to read currents that might bring both fish and favorable winds, and how to mark places where fresh supplies could be obtained became questions of skill and judgment. Over time, charts grew more accurate as captains marked the anchorages that had supplied them, and as pilots exchanged knowledge. Meanwhile, the need to balance exploration with survival continued. The next part of this narration will follow that thread, moving from the hold and the galley up to the quarterdeck and beyond, into the methods of navigation and the discoveries that sustained these long voyages. The men who tended the stores and the men who steered the ship depended on one another, and their choices carried the voyage forward into new waters and new decisions. On the quarterdeck, a small group of men gathered before dawn to prepare for measurement. Instruments lay ready on a clean board. The astrolabe, a flat metal ring with a movable arm, was familiar to pilots. They used it to measure the height of the sun at noon and of selected stars at night. In practice, the pilot waited for the moment when the sun seemed highest. He held the astrolabe at arm's length, sighted along the rule, and read the angle. From that number, he consulted tables that translated the angle into degrees of latitude. These numbers told how far north or south the ship was from the equator. Over time, pilots learned to combine repeated observations to reduce small errors. They compared readings taken on clear days with those taken through thin cloud, and they noted the way the motion of the ship affected the steady hand. Beside the astrolabe, a magnetic compass hung from a gimbal to keep it level. The needle pointed in a general direction, and men read that direction against a card marked with the points of the compass. Pilots paid attention to both the compass and to the known behavior of the needle in local waters. In some regions, the needle did not point to true north. Magnetic variation, as they called it, shifted gradually with place. Over time, seafarers kept records of how the compass differed from the true course, and pilots added corrections to charts and to their own memory. Meanwhile, the material of the ship itself could disturb the needle. Large masses of iron, anchors, and even the presence of a cannon placed near the compass caused deviation. Men on the quarterdeck learned to place the instrument in a fixed binnacle, away from heavy iron, and to check it against known landmarks when possible. Maps and charts completed the set of tools. Portolan charts showed coastlines, anchorages, and the routes that other mariners had followed. They carried an authority that came from use. Pilots consulted the pilot book, or rudder, which contained practical notes on currents, winds, and local hazards recorded by earlier voyages. These written directions described where to drop an anchor in a lee, where a river might be fresh, and which headlands marked a safe approach. Over time, pilots improved charts by adding the notes they gathered, marking reefs they had found, and depths they had sounded. The earliest charts were precise in some parts and uncertain in others. Cartographers copied reports and sometimes introduced errors. To read the sea, therefore, required a mixture of trust and skepticism. Pilots used maps as guides and checked them constantly against what they could see and feel. Timekeeping and the measurement of speed completed the navigator's methods. Glass hourglasses set the interval, while a log and line measured how far the ship passed in that time. A man on the stern cast a chip of wood attached to a line that carried knots at regular spacing. He counted the knots that ran out as the line played, and from that number, he inferred the speed in knots per hour. The pilot then multiplied speed by time to estimate the distance run. This method, called dead reckoning, was straightforward in concept, but subject to several possible errors. Wind and current altered the ship's actual path. Leeway, the sideways slip caused by wind on the sails, shifted a schooner off its intended bearing. Meanwhile, an imprecise glass or an inattentive chipman changed the basic numbers. For these reasons, pilots kept several parallel reckonings, comparing them with celestial observations and with any visible trace of land. Reading the stars required a calm night and an attentive crew. On clear evenings, the pilot identified a star whose position was documented in a table. He measured its altitude with the astrolabe or with a cross staff when conditions favored that instrument. Those measurements supplied latitude. For longitude, there was no reliable clock precise enough to maintain a universal time at sea. Pilots therefore relied on dead reckoning and on coastal sightings to estimate east-west position. They noted differences between predicted and observed landfalls to adjust their expectations. In this way, the art of navigation combined measurement, memory, and practical judgment. Ocean currents influenced navigation as much as instruments did. Some currents moved slowly and were nearly invisible to the eye. Others were strong and carried a ship out of a chosen lane. Pilots learned to read the sea for signs of current. They watched the movement of floating weed and of sargassum. They observed where birds rested and where fish followed a certain line. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain coasts showed a persistent setting, a steady pull toward a particular direction. Pilots recorded these tendencies in the rudder. Meanwhile, wind patterns changed with season and latitude. The trade winds in lower latitudes blew consistently from one direction. The westerlies at higher latitudes favored another. A captain chose a route with these winds in mind. In this way, the ship used the predictable work of the air and the sea to reduce the effort of human steering. Errors of navigation, however, remained common. Magnetic variation could alter a course by many degrees over a long voyage. Without a reliable measure of longitude, east-west position accumulated uncertainty, with every day of dead reckoning. A small error in daily reckoning multiplied and could lead a ship many leagues away from an intended landfall. Mistaken identification of a headland or of a river mouth produced false hopes. A pilot who expected a passage might find a long and dangerous coast instead. Charts sometimes omitted hidden shoals or misrepresented a bay's depth. In such cases, a ship might run aground on rocks not shown on any chart. Men pulled at ropes and shouted orders while others worked the pumps. When the hull held, the crew righted and repaired what they could. When the hull failed, the outcome was loss and at times death. Fog and poor visibility aggravated these risks. In a mist, the sound of distant breakers could be misleading. Pilots heeded the cry of seabirds and the feel of the swell. They used the lead to sound the depth and to sample the nature of the bottom. A lead line, weighted and calibrated, provided a number of fathoms and occasionally brought up a sample of sand or shells. These samples told whether the ship approached sand, rock, or the soft mud of a river mouth. Used regularly, lead lines allowed cautious approaches to coasts that maps left uncertain. In other moments, when currents and wind combined in unfamiliar ways, even the best precautions failed. The unknown remained a persistent element of every voyage. Charts always carried blank spaces, and blank space on a map could be one of two things. In some cases, it signified that no one had yet turned a careful eye to that part of the sea. In others, it indicated places where previous explorers had recorded warning signs without precise coordinates. For men on board, facing the unknown meant accepting both danger and the chance of discovery. Officers debated the best course of action. Caution argued for hugging coasts where soundings and shorelines could be watched. Boldness argued for open sea, where a consistent wind might carry a ship faster and where fewer hidden shoals lay. The captain decided. His choices reflected his experience, his sense of risk, the condition of the ship, and the state of the stores below. Discovery altered the feeling on board in a single instant. When a lookout cried land, or when a new bank of sand appeared on the lead line, the mood changed. Men who had grown used to the sameness of decks and sails turned their attention outward. In this way, the ship's routine shifted quickly from measurement to action. Boats were lowered, men prepared to go ashore. Officers checked the instruments and the charts. In calm voices they assigned tasks. One party to search for fresh water, another to examine the shore for safe landing, a smaller group to record coordinates and to take bearings. Meanwhile, those who remained aboard tended to the ship and to the stores. A fresh source of water or of green plants promised relief for scurvy and for the daily monotony. Thus, discovery carried practical consequences as well as emotional ones. Emotions on such occasions were complex. There was first the immediate relief that food and water might be found. The sight of a green bank or the sound of running water intensified that relief. Men who had worked below decks for weeks without washing or without fresh greens looked forward to cleaning and to eating food that tasted of land. At the same time, discovery brought anxiety. Unknown peoples might be nearby. The shore could hide hostile conditions or dangerous tides. Officers spoke quietly about the risks and reminded men of their duties. They insisted on a measured approach. First, a reconnaissance, then a cautious landing. In this way, curiosity and caution coexisted. Fear did not mean paralysis. Instead, it structured the tasks that men performed. They sharpened their awareness. During a first landing, they kept a sentry posted and a party ready to return at a signal. Boat crews moved carefully, and they took charts with them. Any interaction with strangers required attention to the signals exchanged. Over time, crews developed habits for testing new places. They sent a few men forward to taste the water and to gather greens. They inspected animals at a distance before driving them into pens. When it was safe, they organized the slaughter and the preservation of meat for the voyage ahead. In this way, caution converted fear into a sequence of controlled choices. Wonder arrived for those who had not expected to see particular features. A new river, a certain arrangement of cliffs, or a previously unrecorded island could excite a measured amazement. Men discussed what they saw in low voices. Officers compared the place with pilot books and with memory. They argued about identity, whether a landform matched a name on a chart, or whether it represented an entirely new entry into their maps. Meanwhile, scribes and pilots made careful notes. They measured bearings and distances. They sketched the coastline and noted the qualities of water and soil. Over time, these records would be copied and spread to other ships, improving the charts for the future. In this way, individual acts of wonder contributed to the broader practice of navigation. Discipline shaped how discovery proceeded. The ship's articles, signed before departure, specified duties and punishments. Men knew what was expected of them. Watch schedules determined who looked for land and when. A negligent lookout who missed an obvious cue risked a formal reprimand or a reduction in rations. When an officer gave an order, he expected it to be followed without delay. Discipline ensured that measurements could be taken precisely. When a pilot needed calm and silence to sight a star or to measure the sun at noon, the captain enforced quiet on deck. Instruments required steady hands. Errors that arose from failure to maintain that steady environment could result in the loss of a ship. Therefore, practical enforcement of rules linked directly to survival. Punishments existed in several forms. For minor infractions, a captain might withhold a small portion of pay or impose extra duties. More serious breaches, such as theft from the stores or repeated disobedience, brought corporal punishment or confinement. A man who endangered the ship by drunkenness or by deliberate negligence could receive a public sanction. These measures were not arbitrary. They followed a logic intended to protect the whole crew. Meanwhile, captains exercised discretion. They weighed the harm done against the circumstance and sometimes chose a remedial approach, additional instruction, a reassignment of tasks, or a public declaration of expectations. In this way, discipline was both corrective and preventive. The presence of instruments and charts affected the enforcement of discipline. Pilots maintained logs that recorded bearings, courses, and observations. These logs could serve as evidence when questions arose about mistakes. A careful record made the causes of an error clearer, whether a misreading of the compass, a sudden change in current, or a failure to follow instructions. When disputes about navigation took place, officers consulted these written notes. Over time, the log became not only a navigational tool, but also a legal document. It carried the memory of choices and the sequence of events that led to each decision. Navigation and discovery relied on a continuous dialogue among the tools, the sea, and the people who used them. Instruments supplied numbers, charts supplied expectations, the ocean supplied forces that required interpretation. Men adjusted their behavior in response. They kept watches, they disciplined themselves, and they recorded what they could. As the ship moved from one stretch of known water to the next unknown expanse, the balance among measurement, judgment, and rule defined the voyage. Meanwhile, the next considerations involved how authority was exercised on board, how punishments were administered when rules were broken, and how that order shaped both the small acts of daily work and the larger moments of discovery. In this way, the story continued, moving from the mechanics of navigation into the realm of command and of consequence. Discipline on a ship in the 16th century began before the vessel left the harbor. Men gathered to sign the ship's articles. These articles set out duties, shares of pay, and rules for conduct. They also described the punishments for breaking those rules. In this way, discipline became part of the contract that bound officers and crew together. The captain stood at the center of that contract. He spoke for the owner or for the crown, and he carried the authority to enforce the articles. His voice decided watches, rations, and the order of tasks. He decided when to put to sea and when to make for a lee. Men obeyed because their lives, and often their pay, depended on a predictable chain of command. The role of the captain extended beyond giving orders. He judged the condition of the ship and of the men. He balanced the need for speed with the need for caution. When a pilot returned late or a lookout missed a cue, the captain examined the cause. When stores ran low, he decided who would take on extra work or who would have privileges reduced. He resolved disputes over shares and over the treatment of recovered goods from prize ships. Over time, a good captain earned a measure of trust. Men followed his orders more readily when they believed he understood what the sea demanded. Conversely, a captain who misread wind and tide or who showed favoritism undermined that trust. When authority weakened, so did the structure that discipline provided. Common punishments aboard ships fell into a few familiar categories. For minor offenses, captains often imposed extra labor or the temporary loss of small comforts. A man might be ordered to clean the bilge or to stand a harder watch. For theft, which threatened the whole crew by reducing limited stores, punishments grew more severe. A thief could lose pay, be confined, or, if the theft endangered the voyage, receive corporal punishment. Corporal punishment included flogging, performed publicly, and with strict numbers recorded in the log. The boatswain, or a trusted petty officer, carried out many of these tasks under the captain's orders. The sight of a punishment served as a reminder of the rules and of the consequences of breaking them. More serious breaches of discipline led to confinement in irons or to marooning at a suitable shore when the circumstances allowed it. On naval expeditions and on ships under government commission, a formal court could sit to judge murder, treason, or mutiny. Sentence could be death. These extremes were not the everyday of most voyages, but the possibility of such consequences reinforced obedience. Meanwhile, captains used their discretion. They weighed intent and situation. A man who stole to feed his starving family might receive a different treatment from a man who plundered for personal gain. In this way, punishment aimed at both deterrence and the preservation of the ship's functioning. Mutiny was one of the gravest fears on any long voyage. It represented a breakdown of the social order that kept a ship afloat and on course. Mutinies could start for many reasons. Sailors argued about pay or the fairness of shares. They protested against hard treatment or against the apparent incompetence of an officer. Sickness and hunger increased tension. Prolonged confinement with no visible relief fostered resentment. In other cases, contact with new peoples or the sight of a welcoming shore tempted men to abandon the ship. A mutiny needed an organizing grievance and leaders willing to act. When those conditions appeared together, the consequences could be immediate and dangerous. Captains and officers developed several methods to prevent mutiny. Clear articles and a known division of shares helped. So did prompt and predictable enforcement of rules. When men saw that rules applied even to small transgressions, they understood the system. Sometimes captains rewarded loyalty. Extra pay, a small share of prize goods, or public praise at a muster reinforced a sense of belonging. Meanwhile, physical means of maintaining authority remained present. Weapons were kept where officers could reach them. Trusted sailors served as petty officers or as the captain's immediate aides. In extreme cases, the captain acted swiftly to detain suspected ringleaders. He held a trial if the situation required it. Over time, the balance of persuasion, reward, and the credible threat of force limited the likelihood that a full-scale mutiny would succeed. When mutinies did occur, officers responded with force if they could. They sought to reassert control quickly. A rapid and decisive response prevented a small conspiracy from gathering wider support. When a captain lacked enough loyal hands, he turned to negotiation. He promised partial redress, or he agreed to take grievances to a higher authority at the next port. In some instances, a captain judged that a compromise saved lives and the ship. In others, he acted according to the strict letter of the articles and pursued punishment. Those choices weighed heavily. They affected not only the immediate crisis, but also the future conduct of the crew. The rules and their enforcement shaped daily life in many subtle ways. Watch rotations structured sleep and duty. Meals were served at set hours. Work parties went aloft in silence when the pilot needed calm to take a sight. Men learned to move with purpose and with attention to the expectations of rank. These routines conserved energy and reduced the chance that a small mistake would become a hazard. Yet, they also limited the space for personal autonomy. A man could not choose to sleep when his watch required him to stand. He could not refuse a punishment, expect to be heard at sea, and remain aboard. That lack of control, maintained for reasons of safety and efficiency, also shaped the psychology of sailors. Long voyages imposed a psychological toll that unfolded slowly. The first weeks often passed in disciplined motion. Each man took his place, performed his tasks, and adjusted to the rhythm of sails and rope. Over time, however, the sameness of the daily round weighed on attention. Days blurred. Land grew further from memory. Letters from home, if there had been any, became older and less certain. Meanwhile, the ship's interior life compressed. Men lived within a small number of decks, in the presence of others, with little privacy. Noise and smell were constant companions. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by watches and by sudden weather. For some, confinement bred restlessness. For others, it produced a steady exhaustion that dulled sensation. Illness increased the strain. Scurvy, dysentery, and other ailments reduced strength and morale. A sick man could not fulfill his duties and therefore risked punishment if he shirked. At the same time, caring for the sick diverted attention and labor from the ship's tasks. These pressures sharpened existing conflicts. A disagreement about a ration or about a task could escalate quickly when men were already worn. Over time, resentment built. Petty slights took on larger significance. Friendships frayed. In this way, the physical conditions of the voyage fed into the psychological challenges. The officers faced their own pressures. They carried responsibility for decisions that could end lives or lose the ship. A wrong calculation of sail, an overconfident approach to an unfamiliar coast, or a failure to maintain the mast could result in disaster. Officers needed to present calm and authority even when they felt fear or doubt. They could not always share their uncertainty. To admit error risked undermining the chain of command. For this reason, many officers learned to hide the anxieties that readers of ships' logs sometimes later reveal. Quiet burdens accumulated alongside the daily paperwork. Discipline affected mental health directly. For some men, the certainty of rules provided comfort. They knew what to expect, and that predictability made the environment bearable. For others, strict enforcement felt like a constant threat. The fear of public punishment produced hypervigilance. Men guarded their every action and speech. Over time, this restraint could harden into bitterness. In turn, bitterness fueled insubordination. Captains therefore sought a careful mix of firmness and fairness. When he administered justice with measured deliberation, he reduced the likelihood that punishment itself would seed rebellion. Social bonds formed a counterweight to these strains. Men found companionship in shared work. They developed small rituals that helped mark time. A handful sang together while hauling a line. Others traded stories in low voices during a quiet watch. Meanwhile, practical cooperation mattered. A sailor who depended on others to furl a sail or to stow a cable learned to trust his peers. Those reciprocal dependencies built a common interest in the ship's survival. In this way, daily cooperation and mutual reliance softened the edges of strict discipline. Alcohol and tobacco played a role in managing tension. A ration of beer or wine, when available, served as a small relief. Tobacco became a common habit among many men, and the act of sharing a pipe could ease conversation. Officers sometimes used these comforts as rewards. Yet when such substances ran short, or when men became dependent on them, they introduced new problems. Drunkenness increased the risk of accidents and of infractions that required punishment. The captain faced recurring decisions about when to allow indulgence and when to restrict it. Letters and news formed another form of relief. A message from home, if delivered before departure, lingered in the mind. Men kept personal items where possible: a coin, a scrap of cloth, a needle and thread for mending. These small possessions helped maintain a sense of identity. Over time, the absence of new information intensified longing. That longing sometimes led to risk. Men tempted by shore leave in a foreign port acted impulsively. They spent money meant for the voyage and returned late or not at all. Each loss weakened the social fabric of the crew and increased the likelihood that stricter measures would follow. The constant pressure of life at sea also shaped how religion and belief operated on board. Prayer and ritual offered structure, and a shared vocabulary for expressing fear and hope. Chaplains, when present, conducted services and offered counsel. Meanwhile, informal practices arose among the crew. Men crossed themselves at certain moments. They observed small superstitions about how to handle an animal or how to speak of a woman. These practices provided psychological comfort and a sense of control in situations where formal rules and punishments might not reach. The relationship between formal discipline and informal belief deserves careful attention, for it influenced how men understood authority and chance. In the quiet hours after an enforcement, when a punishment had been recorded in the log, and the ship settled to its regular tasks, men turned their minds to other ways of coping. In this way, the story of discipline and punishment moved directly into questions about faith, about ritual, and about the superstitions that accompanied life at sea. Before a ship left the harbor, religion often marked the boundary between land and sea. Men gathered to attend Mass when a priest or a chaplain was available. Bells rang from nearby churches, and small groups moved toward the quay. In some ports, a priest went aboard to bless the ship. He sprinkled holy water on the decks and on the spars. He made the sign of the cross over stores and over the arms and tools that would be needed. These actions established a shared frame of reference. In this way, the voyage began not only as a commercial or military undertaking, but also as an act that had spiritual dimensions. Rituals varied by place and by faith, but certain practices were common. Sailors carried objects for protection. A crucifix or a rosary often hung near the mast. Small images of saints were kept in the captain's cabin or in the forecastle. Men wore simple tokens sewn into their clothing. Meanwhile, shipmasters might keep a list of vows made before the voyage. A man promised a sum of money to a church if he survived, or he promised to say a number of prayers each day. In ports where chapels ministered to sailors, offerings were left on altars. These tokens served as public reminders of commitments made in the presence of others. During the voyage, prayer continued to structure daily life. Before meals, men crossed themselves and uttered brief prayers of thanks. Officers sometimes ordered a communal prayer when the weather grew uncertain. The bell was used to call the crew to devotions, and the sound of scripture being read eased the long hours of a calm sea. In this way, faith established small ceremonies that punctuated the routine. They marked time and created a sense of continuity between days that otherwise blurred one into another. Chaplains had a practical and a pastoral role aboard many ships. When present, they conducted Mass and heard confessions. They ministered to the sick and to the dying. Their duties included preparing bodies for burial at sea, which required careful handling, and a solemn ritual read aloud for all to hear. Chaplains also served as moral authorities. They advised captains on matters of conscience and sometimes mediated disputes among men. In this way, the chaplain's office supported both spiritual needs and the social order necessary for the voyage to continue. Not every vessel carried a chaplain, and when one was absent, men improvised. A captain or a respected petty officer might lead simple prayers. Sailors used the phrases and gestures they had learned at home. Over time, these informal practices gained their own consistency. Shared rituals took hold whether or not a book of common prayer was available. In this way, faith became woven into ordinary routines, not only through formal clergy, but also through the repeated, public acts of the crew. Beliefs about the sea itself shaped how men made sense of danger. Many sailors accepted a world in which natural events could also bear moral or supernatural meaning. Strange lights on the masts, a sudden change in bird behavior, or the appearance of certain stars might be read as an omen. A comet in the sky or a red eclipse provoked talk and prayer. Some signs were interpreted as warnings of storms. Others suggested good fortune. Over time, crews developed a catalog of such signs. When men perceived a pattern, they adjusted their behavior accordingly. They reefed sails earlier, cut away topmasts, or made extra offerings at the sight of a perceived warning. Sea monsters occupied a place in this system of belief. Reports circulated of enormous fish, of long tentacles seen in the trough of a wave, and of great shapes that moved beneath the surface. Mariners described creatures they had seen at a distance and sought explanations. Some thought these beings were real and dangerous. Others viewed them as tests of courage or as reminders of the sea's vastness. Regardless of the modern assessment of such sightings, they affected decisions. Sailors took care when unfamiliar shapes appeared. They avoided loud noises that might provoke an animal. They also spoke of these creatures during long watches, and the stories became part of the ship's memory. In this way, the possibility of unseen danger remained present in everyday life. Certain natural phenomena gained a particular spiritual significance. St. Elmo's fire, a faint luminous discharge on the tips of masts and yards, was often described in the logs and in sailors' accounts. Many read it as a sign of saintly presence. Some believed it indicated that a patron saint stood guard over the ship. Others viewed it with unease, because its appearance sometimes preceded storms. Dolphins or pods of small whales that followed a ship were taken as good omens by many. Birds flying toward land suggested proximity to shore. In contrast, an unexpected flock circling a vessel at night might be regarded as a bad sign. The meaning of each event depended on local tradition and on the state of mind among the crew. In this way, nature and belief formed a continuous conversation during the voyage. Formal vows and promises had practical consequences. A man who promised to give a portion of prize money to a church expected others to remember his pledge. Captains sometimes recorded these promises in the ship's papers. When a man fulfilled a vow, his act reinforced confidence in the social order. If he failed, the disappointment could become a source of gossip and of moral judgment. Meanwhile, rituals served to relieve individual anxiety. The act of confession, when available, allowed a man to unburden himself. Shared prayers converted private fear into public expression. In this way, faith offered a means of transforming inner tension into a communal response. When storms gathered, religious practice often intensified. Crews called for help aloud and clutched tokens they kept close. The captain ordered prayers, and if a chaplain was present, Mass might be read in the waist where others could hear. Men went below to secure sacred objects. Sometimes a solemn procession moved through the decks, stopping at the pieces of wood that bore the most meaning for the crew. In these moments, the ritual performed a double function. It appealed for protection, and it organized action. Men tightened lines, lashed down barrels, and prayed. Their movements became part of the same sequence. In this way, ritual and labor combined to manage danger. Prayers before dangerous tasks were common. A man about to climb the rigging made the sign of the cross and spoke a short petition. Boats leaving the ship to go ashore in small crews repeated a short prayer before they cast off. In ports where local chapels served sailors, a blessing might be sought before a hazardous assignment. These practices expressed both a recognition of risk and a structured response to it. They encouraged caution and helped men to prepare mentally for difficult work. In this way, faith operated as an instrument of discipline, as well as of consolation. Chaplains also played a role in maintaining morale. They heard confessions and gave counsel. They read letters from home that had been smuggled into the captain's cabin on request to keep a man's spirits. When a man died, the chaplain pronounced the words for burial and guided the crew through the ritual of lowering a body into the sea. Those precise words and gestures offered a moment of closure. They let men invoke a tradition and place their grief in a form that others recognized. In that way, ceremony helped the living to proceed with their tasks, while acknowledging that human loss had occurred. Faith could act as a form of social control as well. Authorities on board used religious language to strengthen obedience. A captain reminded his crew of their oaths in terms that invoked divine witness. Punishments were sometimes administered while invoking moral judgment. Men who transgressed were urged to repent. Over time, such appeals could align personal conscience with the ship's rules. At the same time, the use of religion in this way could also cause resentment. When clerical authority seemed to justify excessive punishment, crew members questioned the sincerity of the ritual. The balance between consolation and coercion required delicate handling. Belief systems were not uniform. Crews included men from different regions and from different backgrounds. Some brought strong parish practices from their home ports. Others had less formal connections to organized worship. Over time, a ship developed a working culture that incorporated a variety of traditions. Songs, prayers, and small superstitions mixed together. A man from one district might teach others a short litany that he had learned as a child. Meanwhile, sailors picked up phrases and customs from ports they visited. In this way, the life of faith aboard ship was flexible and adaptive. Informal practices often became as important as formal rites. Men exchanged small charms. They kept a scrap of paper with a verse of scripture tucked inside a chest. They marked a cross on a batten before passing a difficult knot to a partner. These repeated gestures developed into habits that calm the hand and steady the mind. Over time, they formed a quiet background to the work at sea. Their effect might be small in any single instance, but accumulated practice changed how men responded under pressure. In this way, the private forms of devotion contributed to the general atmosphere on board. When new and unfamiliar places appeared on the horizon, faith adapted to new circumstances. Sailors interpreted unfamiliar coasts and new peoples in terms they already knew. A populated shore might be seen as a providential gift. An uninhabited reef could be read as a place of danger in need of vigil. In some cases, sailors sought the blessing of local shrines before landing. In others, they brought their own prayers ashore and established small crosses to mark a successful landing. Over time, such acts became part of the broader pattern of exploration. They expressed both a hope for safety and an attempt to impose moral order on a world they did not yet fully understand. Faith also provided stories, and stories shaped memory. Accounts of narrow escapes, of prayers answered at sea, and of saints who had intervened traveled from ship to ship. Captains repeated these stories at muster to remind men of both danger and grace. When a man had survived a wreck or a siege of storms, others asked how he had prayed. These narratives circulated in the same way that news and impressions did. They influenced expectations and encouraged the repetition of practices believed to have proven effective. In this way, oral tradition reinforced the role of religion in managing the uncertainties of the sea. For many men, faith offered a distinct kind of comfort. It supplied an explanation for suffering and a language for hope. In the face of sickness and hunger, prayer gave structure to days that might otherwise feel emptied of meaning. Small rituals provided a sense of control. Vows created a future moment when a debt of thanksgiving could be paid. Shared prayer expressed communal concern. In this way, religion helped individuals and groups to endure hardship and to continue their labors. Not every appeal to faith brought comfort. Doubt and anger also emerged. Some men questioned why a benevolent power allowed suffering. Others resented the use of religion in enforcing discipline. Such tensions existed alongside the consolations. Over time, however, many men found that ritual practice and shared belief lessened the burden of uncertainty. They did not dispel danger, but they offered mental resources to face it. In this way, faith became an ordinary, practical tool on voyages, where survival often depended on a combination of skill, discipline, and mutual trust. As the voyage continued and the ship approached new waters, watchful eyes scanned the horizon with both a practical and a spiritual attention. Sailors searched for signs of land or of other vessels. They compared the behavior of birds and the swell of the sea against the catalog of omens they carried in memory. Meanwhile, men made their short prayers and tightened lines. The nervous energy of anticipation moved through the decks. A lookout called down a word that could be either hope or warning, and all turned to see what followed. In this way, the life of faith, of small rituals, and of careful observation led directly into the next phase of the voyage, where new encounters and the work of exploration awaited. When a ship first put into an unknown harbor, the moment was quiet in a particular way. Men moved with deliberate care. Small boats were prepared, ropes were checked, and knots were set. Meanwhile, some of the crew remained on board to tend the ship, watching the sails and the tide. Others went ashore in parties that varied according to orders, circumstance, and the temperament of the captain. The landing itself combined routine and uncertainty. Men stepped onto unfamiliar ground and made simple observations about the soil, the plants, and the slope of the shore. They listened for voices and for sounds of animals. They watched how people approached them, and they watched how local people watched them. First contact with new peoples took many forms. In some places, indigenous men and women came down to the beach with goods to trade. They brought food, pottery, cloth, or objects fashioned from local materials. These exchanges allowed both sides to see what the other carried and what the other valued. Items that seemed ordinary to one group were curiosities to the other. In other places, people stood back on higher ground and observed from a distance. Some sent small parties to meet the newcomers halfway. Language proved a constant barrier. Few travelers shared a common tongue. Gestures and simple signs filled the initial gaps in speech. A gift offered with both hands, or the showing of an open palm, could express goodwill. At the same time, a sudden movement or the drawing of a knife created alarm. The shape of an encounter depended on these small choices. Curiosity was widespread. Sailors wanted to know what crops were raised, what animals were kept, and how shelters were made. They asked about water and about the best places to careen a hull. Meanwhile, the visitors wanted to know about the ship and its equipment. They examined ropes, the shape of sails, and the iron on the anchors. They looked at metal tools and at small firearms if the crew carried them. Over time, these observations shaped practical decisions. A captain who learned that a particular cove had good trees and few rocks might plan to return for supplies. A carpenter who saw a local method of joining planks might adapt a technique. In this way, curiosity led directly to useful knowledge. Fear was ever present as well. Each side carried stories of danger. Sailors feared hidden attacks, poisoned food, and treacherous shoals. Local people feared violence, disease, and the loss of land. Where misunderstandings escalated into conflict, the results could be sudden and bloody. Firearms and cannon gave sailors a form of shock that local defenders had not encountered in the same way. Conversely, familiarity with the land gave local people advantages in ambush and retreat. Over time, many interactions settled into a wary pattern. Parties traded at a distance. Hosts invited visitors to observe, but not to follow. In this way, early encounters were often marked by a careful weighing of risk. Ambition shaped the behavior of those who sailed with specific commissions. Merchants sought new trade routes and profitable goods. State agents sought claims over territory and the extraction of resources. Missionaries sought souls to convert. Captains balanced these directives with the immediate needs of the crew. Orders from home could be precise, but circumstances at sea were unpredictable. A crew could be sent to occupy a small island, to survey a harbor, or to find a river that might lead inland. Each task demanded decisions that mixed caution with boldness. Ambition could push men beyond safe judgment. At the same time, the promise of reward motivated long hours of work and careful planning. In this way, enterprise became a central element of exploration. Recording discoveries was a deliberate practice. Captains kept logbooks that noted the position of land, the bearing of coastal features, and the distances sailed each day. Officers measured the ship's latitude with instruments such as the astrolabe or the cross staff. Soundings were taken to estimate depth. Crew members marked important features like reefs, headlands, and safe anchorages. Meanwhile, artists made sketches of coastlines and of objects encountered ashore. These drawings varied in skill and in accuracy. Some were careful plans made for later reference. Others were quick studies intended to remind the recorder of a shape or a color. Over time, these various records were combined into charts and maps. Cartographers in home ports used the information that returning ships brought. They translated bearings and distances into lines on paper. In some cases, they compared notes from different voyages to correct errors. Portolan charts and early world maps changed gradually as new data arrived. In this way, knowledge that once rested in the memories of crews became public, or at least accessible to those who read the maps. The act of mapping also altered how sailors thought about the world. Where once they navigated by coastlines, stars, and local knowledge, they began to see routes in terms of lines on a chart and waypoints to be reached. Over time, this shift influenced planning, provisioning, and the selection of crew for future voyages. The material recording of discovery took other forms too. Naturalists, when present, collected specimens of plants and animals. They pressed leaves and wrote descriptions of fruit, bark, and seed. Physicians noted the effects of local remedies. These notes sometimes found their way into cabinets of curiosities or into the notebooks of scholars. Merchants logged sources of commodities and estimated their value for markets back home. These practical accounts influenced trade decisions. If a new crop seemed promising, agents at ports considered how to cultivate or transport it. In this way, the act of recording discoveries connected the sea to markets and to scientific study. Encounters changed the sailors themselves. Practical skills broadened. Men learned new ways to handle unfamiliar winds and currents. They adopted local techniques for preserving food or for repairing gear. Language skills were acquired in simple forms. A man who spent a season ashore might return with a few words and with a different understanding of local social customs. Meanwhile, the experience of seeing distant horizons altered a person's sense of scale. Many returned with stories that shifted their expectations of the world. Some became more confident in their craft. Others found their nerves altered by the strain of long voyages. In this way, exploration affected people at an individual level. At the same time, the world beyond Europe changed. New goods traveled along the routes carved by sailing ships. Crops moved across oceans. Staples like maize, potatoes, and manioc came to new continents and altered diets. Animals such as horses transformed economies and the patterns of warfare in some regions. Metals and other valuables circulated more widely, sometimes concentrating wealth in new hands. Over time, these material exchanges reshaped local and global economies. Markets adapted to new supplies and new demands. Trade networks that once relied on short coastal hops extended into broader circuits. In this way, the movement of goods linked distant places more closely than before. Ideas moved as well. Missionaries brought religious teachings and set up small chapels or schools. In some cases, they learned local languages and worked with translators. In others, they relied on force or on alliances with local elites. Knowledge of navigation, shipbuilding, and metallurgy spread in both directions. Craftsmen learned new methods from one another. Meanwhile, political relationships changed. Claims of sovereignty were declared on maps and recorded in royal papers. Treaties and rivalries emerged. Soon, the presence of foreign powers affected local politics. Leaders adjusted their policies in response to new trade opportunities and to new threats. In this way, exploration created political consequences that reached far beyond the immediate landing. Disease played a devastating role in many contacts. People on all sides lacked immunity to illnesses carried by others. When new pathogens arrived, entire communities could be affected. The result was often severe demographic change. Labor systems shifted as populations declined in some regions and as demand for labor rose in others. These changes had long-term consequences for social organization and for economic strategies. In this way, biological exchange became a major factor in the process of exploration and settlement. Violence and coercion also played a part of the story. At times, captains and traders resorted to force to secure goods or labor. Practices such as taking hostages, imposing tribute, or engaging in slaving raids occurred in many places. These actions altered social structures and created cycles of resistance and repression. Local leaders sometimes resisted with arms, sometimes negotiated, and sometimes formed alliances. Over time, the balance of power shifted in ways that varied by region. In this way, exploration could bring both opportunity and hardship to the same communities. Maps and written reports influenced the decisions made by those who financed voyages. Merchants and state officials studied charts to choose where to invest and where to send fleets. In this way, a map could shape policy. Once a harbor was marked as safe and a coast recorded as navigable, the chances increased that more ships would follow. Meanwhile, stories of wealth and resources tempted others to attempt similar voyages. Ambition spread through networks of information. Over time, certain routes became well established, while other paths remained little known. In this way, the dissemination of information directed the flows of people and goods. Sailors who returned from long voyages carried more than reports. They brought home new vocabularies, new tastes, and sometimes new religious practices picked up abroad. Families at home adapted to the knowledge of new places. News circulated in taverns and in the courts of those who held power. This flow of information influenced art, literature, and the sciences. Scholars debated the best methods of measurement and of cartography. Shipwrights experimented with hull design based on reports of how vessels had performed on distant seas. In this way, the practical experience of voyages fed into wider changes in technology and in thought. Not all changes were immediate. Many developments unfolded slowly, across decades and generations. Some contacts led to sustained relationships that grew into long-term trade. Others proved temporary, fading as priorities shifted. Meanwhile, the presence of foreign goods and foreign ideas created new patterns of consumption and new social distinctions. Over time, certain ports became hubs of exchange, while others declined. Colonies and trading posts emerged in places where power could be maintained at a distance. In this way, the slow accumulation of voyages and encounters reconfigured the map of human activity. The psychological impact on individuals could be lasting. Some men found the sea a place they preferred to life ashore and took further voyages as soon as they could. Others returned to their hometowns and found themselves distant from local routines. Families sometimes welcomed back skilled sailors who brought improved techniques for building or for fishing. At the same time, many returned with wounds, scars, or memories of loss. Those who had seen new forms of wealth sometimes found their expectations changed. These outcomes varied, and in this way, exploration altered lives in unpredictable and personal ways. As more voyages followed the first contacts, patterns of interaction became clearer. Port networks developed. Lists of friendly and unfriendly places were kept. Practical knowledge of provisioning, of local winds, and of seasonal weather improved. Navigational practices refined. In time, charts grew more detailed and more widely used. Meanwhile, sailors and merchants adapted their plans in response to the new information they gathered. The process resembled an ongoing conversation between sea and land, between travelers and residents, and between those who financed voyages and those who carried them out. It was a conversation that continued to shape what came next. From the decks of a returning ship, men looked differently at their home coasts. Provisioning for a longer stay required different accounts than for a short cruise. Meanwhile, captains prepared their logs and their charts for the officials who would receive them. Messages were drafted to patrons at home, and samples were stored carefully. Ships carried not only men, but also objects that would feed further interest. In this way, the moment before the voyage's end contained the materials for new voyages, new maps, and new encounters. As the story moved toward the next phase of returning and reporting, the first sighting of land after a long voyage carried a weight that was both simple and immediate. A lookout called from the masthead. Voices passed quickly along the shrouds and down to the deck. Men who had watched nothing but sky and sea for weeks or months straightened as if a question at last had an answer. The ship's course changed little at once, but the tone among the crew did. Tasks that had been routine became charged with attention. Sails were checked, rigging eased or tightened, and a new round of measurements was taken to confirm position. In this way, the moment of sighting brought a cluster of actions, practical and quick, that prepared the vessel for its approach. Joy did not arrive as a single feeling. It came instead as several small reactions that spread among the men. Some laughed aloud. Others kept quiet, eyes fixed on the land as if they sought a detail that would prove it real. Brief conversations ranged from the trivial to the urgent. A man would ask about his family, another about his share of pay. Meanwhile, officers confirmed the plan for entering the harbor, and the captain consulted his logs. Over time, the excitement settled into a focused energy. The work of piloting, anchoring, and preparing to go ashore absorbed most of the crew. Exhaustion was present in equal measure. Bodies that had endured cramped hammocks, salt, and the constant motion of the ship showed it plainly. Hands bore calluses and wounds. Faces that once were alert now carried a blankness that only rest could cure. Even when the land came into view, sleep still tugged at many. They moved with a slow steadiness. A meal eaten upon sighting tasted of plain need. In this way, the return to land did not erase fatigue. It simply offered a chance to attend to it. Loss was remembered as the ship steered toward port. Names were spoken quietly in the cock of the ship. A place at a table remained empty. A pair of boots were still tied under a locker. The rituals for those who had died at sea were practical and brief. Crews had ways to mark a death, to record it in the logbook, and to perform whatever rites the captain allowed. Yet the memory of those who did not return to their homes followed the living men ashore. Relatives and neighbors would later hear the official lists. Friends at the tavern would repeat the names. In small ways, the losses shaped how the returning men carried themselves. They spoke less of certain moments and more of others. Over time, some found ways to live with the memory. Others remained unsettled. Approaching a port introduced a new set of work. A pilot might come aboard to steer the ship through shallow channels. Meanwhile, a longboat carried shore-bound messages. The captain prepared manifests and the log. Those responsible for the ship's stores made inventories. Cargo was secured and noted. When the anchor found a berth, the crew waited for permission to land. Officials from the port came out in small boats. They checked papers, inspected holds, and sometimes took samples for examination. There were formalities to complete. These procedures connected the voyage to the administration of trade and state interests. In this way, arrival became the beginning of a different form of labor. Stepping onto a quay after months at sea felt particular. The air had a sameness to it when compared with the continuous motion of the ocean. People on shore moved with a steadier gait. The sounds of the town were new after the long rhythms of wind and rigging. Homecomings unfolded in many forms. Some men found family waiting at the dock. Others walked to lodgings with messages pinned to the door of their absence. There were reunions that involved tears and laughter. There were quiet meetings when an elder asked for an account of what had been carried. In some cases, friends came to help with the sale of goods. Yet not all returns were joyful. A man who had come seeking fortune might find that markets had shifted. Credit arrangements might be different. A captain might have to answer difficult questions from patrons and officials. In this way, the shore presented a complex scene of relief, responsibility, and negotiation. The port itself could appear altered from the year before. New warehouses might be rising along the waterfront. Flags displayed different colors. Merchants from distant places walked the quays. Prices posted in the market had changed. News carried on the wind told of recent wars, new policies, or economic shifts in the capital. Meanwhile, new objects that had arrived on other ships showed unfamiliar materials and shapes. The returning crew became part of a larger flow of information and goods. They passed their own cargo into this stream. Thus, the act of returning did not only bring individuals back to familiar streets, it introduced new things into those streets and forced a reckoning with change. Customs and port authorities had their own rhythms. Goods might be held for inspection. Duties were calculated. Questions about origin and destination were asked and answered. Some commodities were welcomed because of demand at home. Others drew suspicion because they were new or because they carried risk, as with plant material or animals that might introduce disease. Quarantine rules could delay a ship's entry or movement of crew ashore. These practical restraints shaped the experience of landing. Meanwhile, reports were copied and forwarded to those who had financed the voyage. In this way, the arrival connected local officials with distant patrons and with the larger mechanisms of trade and governance. The social consequences of a return could be immediate and complicated. A successful voyage might bring a man new standing in his community. He could be able to start a small business, buy land, or draw notice from local authorities. Some captains received a pension or a formal reward. Conversely, failure to meet expectations could produce financial trouble. Creditors might gather. Lawsuits sometimes followed. A crew member who had lost savings might find himself asking for work ashore. Children who had been born in the absence of a sailor might have a father who knew his offspring for the first time. In this way, the return reshaped domestic arrangements and local economies. Reports written on the voyage were read with attention. Officials studied the logbook and the chart. Merchants examined samples and invoices. Specimens, pressed plants, and pieces of cloth were shown to scholars and to those with curiosity in the port. Over time, these items entered collections or were cataloged for use in further planning. Cartographers copied notes into larger charts. In this way, the knowledge gathered became an asset that shaped future decisions. A harbor described as safe and a route noted as favorable increased the likelihood that others would follow the same course. In this way, the returning ship added to a shared pool of information. The legacy of those who crossed unknown seas extended beyond immediate commerce. New techniques and tools moved from ship to shore. Sailors taught carpenters how to repair techniques learned in foreign coves. Mariners shared knowledge about winds and currents that a harbor pilot might use in a new passage. Cooks showed ways of preserving food that reduced spoilage. In these small transfers, practical skills spread. Over time, workshops and yards incorporated these innovations. In this way, the practical labor of a voyage influenced local craft and industry. At the same time, the wider consequences were not only technical. New crops and animals that arrived on ships changed diets and work. In some regions, a new plant took hold and became a staple. In others, the introduction of livestock altered patterns of land use. Markets adjusted to new supplies, and merchants altered investment accordingly. Alongside these changes came legal and political questions. Who owned a newly found resource? How did existing land rights adjust to new demands? Officials and local leaders negotiated agreements and sometimes clashed. These processes unfolded slowly and unevenly, affecting different people in different ways. In this way, the arrival of goods and species carried long-term implications for societies. Memory shaped how communities remembered a voyage. Songs and stories circulated in taverns and in family homes. Over time, these accounts could take on different tones. Some celebrated bravery and endurance. Others emphasized loss and caution. Official reports often differed from private tales. Histories recorded in port books might note a discovery, while a sailor's own account described daily hardships not mentioned in print. In this way, memory remained contested, and the past was understood through multiple lenses. Moral questions followed the return as well. The means used to acquire goods and labor were discussed, and at times condemned. Practices that had been common in the past were re-examined in light of new information and shifting values. Local leaders, religious figures, and merchants debated what was acceptable commerce. Laws were proposed, and agreements altered. Meanwhile, some actions did not change quickly. Violence and coercion continued in places where power could be projected safely. These tensions made the legacy of voyages a subject of ongoing dispute. In this way, the ethical dimension of exploration remained an active part of public life. The personal legacy for many sailors was ambiguous. Some men took to shore life easily and adapted their skills to local trades. Others found the re-entry difficult. The motion of the sea could alter a man's equilibrium. He might be restless in a small town. Where a pension or steady work was available, some settled. Where none existed, others returned to sea at the earliest chance. Families adjusted as circumstances allowed. Children grew, markets changed, and friends aged. In this way, the long-term outcome for individuals varied widely. Institutions learned too. Shipbuilders, insurers, and investors adjusted their methods based on what returning crews reported. Contracts were rewritten, insurance calculations refined, and ship designs modified in light of new evidence. In this way, the act of coming home influenced not only the immediate transactions, but also the broader structures that supported maritime activity. The act of reporting continued after men had stepped ashore. Letters were drafted and copied. Charts were corrected. Men prepared to answer questions from those who had sent them. Sometimes, a captain was summoned to court or to an office to justify actions taken during the voyage. Other times, he simply signed receipts and accepted payment. The crew dispersed. Some found work in the city. Others took time to rest. Yet for those who had been part of exploration, there was often the sense of being part of a continuing enterprise. Objects taken from distant shores were stored, studied, and sometimes exhibited. In this way, the material results of a voyage entered into new circuits of meaning and use. News of a voyage spread beyond the port. Merchants in other towns heard reports in markets and in letters. Governments in the capital read dispatches. Over time, policies shifted in response to repeated findings. A route that proved reliable began to attract more ships. Efforts at colonization or at establishing trading privileges followed when the economic case seemed strong. In this way, the information brought back by a single ship could multiply through decisions made by many. Those who returned carried an evolving identity. They had seen lands and people outside their known world. Some retained a technical curiosity about what they had observed. Others became teachers of the next generation of sailors. In workshops and in harbors, their experience became part of the instruction given to apprentices. Lists of safe harbors and dangerous reefs moved from spoken memory to written charts. In this way, knowledge became more stable and more widely available. The next phases of action often began while the ship still lay at anchor. Men made preparations for what would follow. Repairs were planned. Contracts were negotiated for cargoes and for future voyages. Officers updated their notes and shared them with those who would use them. Meanwhile, patrons debated how to apply what they had learned. Some proposed new expeditions. Others called for caution. In this way, the circle of return and preparation for what came next continued to turn. The moment of landfall, the passage through the port, the reception by family and authorities, and the longer consequences for trade, law, and memory were all parts of a single, ongoing process. The people who crossed unknown seas came back with more than objects. They brought stories, knowledge, and questions that had no single answer. In this way, their return opened new rooms of inquiry and new obligations for those at home and abroad. The work of recording, deciding, and responding began again. As the voyage's results flowed into everyday life and into plans for voyages yet to be undertaken, the work of coming ashore led in time to a different kind of duty and a different kind of care. Men sorted papers, told their stories, and answered questions from those who had waited. Some found relief in small comforts. Others faced obligations that would keep them busy for weeks. Meanwhile, the knowledge and objects they brought continued to be examined and to shape decisions beyond the key. Allowing oneself to stop mattered. Bodies and minds needed pause after months at sea. Sleep returned more easily when tasks were done, and when the immediate account of the voyage had been given. In this way, rest became part of the voyage's final work, as necessary as any repair or ledger. Let the day wind down. Let the hands unbind and the eyes close. Good rest.